Hey, so tonight we're diving into one of the darkest, strangest chapters in human history, the years after the Black Death. And trust me, this isn't some dry history lecture. This was the moment when the world as people knew it completely collapsed. Cities emptied, farms abandoned, whole families gone, and the survivors had to rebuild life from the ashes. We're talking about hunger so bad people boiled grass to eat, traded gold for a loaf of bread, and yes, even turned to snakes and rats just to stay alive. Oh, and before we start, if you love falling asleep to stories that make history feel real, maybe hit that like or subscribe. It helps more than you think. Also, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Drop your city and time in the comments. Always amazes me how people all around the world are listening to this while drifting off to sleep. All right. Settle in. Take a deep breath. Let your shoulders drop. The fire's crackling, the storm's passing, and we're about to travel back to a Europe reborn from death, scarred, starving, but still fighting to live. The hunger that followed the death. When the bells finally stopped tolling, the silence was worse. It was the spring of 1350, and the plague had passed like a ghost that took nearly everyone with it. The fields outside the village of Saint-Aubert were overgrown and still wet from the long frost. Birds had come back, but they sang to no one. The smoke from the last pyres had faded into pale streaks above the ruins of the town, and what was left of the living were only shadows of what had once been called people. They said the Black Death had ended. But for those still breathing, a different kind of death had just begun, slow, hollow, and gnawing from the inside. The first to starve were the children. No one wanted to say it out loud, but every mother in the village counted the days since her last scrap of flour. The rats that had once brought disease were gone too, caught and eaten long ago. The cats had vanished soon after. By summer, not a bark or meow could be heard across Saint-Aubert, only the wind, and the low moaning of people dreaming about bread. Among the survivors was a man named Thomas, a carpenter before the plague, now little more than bone and memory. His wife Elise had died in winter. His son Mathieu lay buried behind their hut, under a mound so small it didn't even need a cross. Thomas no longer prayed. He worked. Every morning he searched the abandoned houses for anything that could be eaten, bartered, or burned. He'd once shaped wood for cathedrals. Now he used his skills to pry open locked cupboards for crumbs. And one afternoon, in the ruins of a manor at the edge of the woods, he found something moving. It was long, black, and coiled in the shadow of a broken stair. A snake. Sluggish from the cold, its scales dull like wet leather. Thomas froze. He hadn't seen a living creature in days. His stomach twisted painfully, not from fear, but hunger. He swung his axe. The sound echoed like thunder in the empty house. The snake twitched once, then lay still. Thomas didn't hesitate. He wrapped it in cloth, brought it home, and boiled it in a cracked pot with a handful of grass. The smell was awful, earthy, sour, but when he swallowed the first bite, he cried. It was the first warmth he'd felt in months. By nightfall, word had spread. People whispered, the carpenter found food. Within days, the woods filled with desperate villagers hunting for anything that crawled. Men tore apart logs for worms. Women dug up the frozen earth searching for roots. Snakes became a kind of treasure. Dangerous, yes, but edible. And soon, Thomas wasn't the only one willing to kill for them. One evening, as he dragged another catch home, he saw two men waiting near his door. They were strangers, gaunt, wild-eyed, one holding a rusty knife. "Share," one of them said. His voice was calm, but his hands shook. Thomas looked at them. There was nothing to share, not really. Only a pot of thin snake broth. But refusing would mean death. So he stepped aside and nodded. They ate in silence, their faces lit by the faint glow of the fire. No one spoke of gratitude. No one spoke at all. When they left, Thomas noticed one of them had stolen his last candle. That night, he realized the plague had taken their bodies, but hunger had stolen their souls. As summer deepened, famine spread across all of France. The soil was poisoned with rot. No one was left to plow or sow. Whole estates went to ruin. Dogs turned wild. Rivers ran red from dead fish, and every wind smelled faintly of decay. The church said it was God's test. The peasants said it was hell, but a few, like Thomas, understood something else. The world was changing. The old order had died with the millions buried under it. Lords, priests, merchants, gone. Only the cunning survived. He began traveling, trading scraps of woodwork for food, crossing villages that looked like ghost towns. Once he found a monastery turned into a graveyard. The monks had left behind books and gold chalices, but no bread. He took the gold, not to sell, but to melt for nails. In one ruined port town, he met Isolde, a widow whose eyes still burned with life. She had survived by fishing in the frozen shallows, catching eels with her bare hands. She'd eaten worse than that, she said, frogs, weeds. Even her own shoe leather boiled to mush. When Thomas told her about the snakes, she laughed. "Then we are all becoming like the beasts we once feared," she said. And together, they built a small camp by the river, sharing whatever the water gave. Sometimes that meant a fish. Sometimes only mud and hope. But hope is fragile in a dying world. By autumn, the king's soldiers began sweeping the countryside again, not to help, but to collect taxes and grain for the nobles who still clung to power. They took everything they could carry, sometimes even the dead, for fear they were hiding silver in their shrouds. When they reached Saint-Aubert, they found Thomas and Isolde by the river. "By royal decree," said the captain, "all provisions belong to the crown." Thomas laughed, hollow and bitter. "Then tell your crown to eat snakes," he said. The soldier struck him with the flat of his sword. Isolde screamed, but Thomas didn't rise. His body was too weak. When the soldiers left, they took what little they had and the pot, the blankets, even the bones of the last snake. That night, Thomas sat by the ashes of their fire and said quietly, "If God watches, he must be laughing." Isolde put her hand on his. "Then let him laugh," she whispered. "We'll still live." And they did, barely. They followed the rivers north, sleeping under trees, trading stories with other survivors. Everywhere the same tales, people eating bark, people eating the dead, people praying to empty skies. But sometimes, amid the horror, there were signs of rebirth. A child's laughter, a flower blooming where bones once lay, a loaf of bread shared by strangers without asking anything in return. By the winter of 1351, the plague was gone, and so were half the people of Europe. But those who remained began to understand something strange. In losing everything, they had gained a kind of freedom. The fields were open. The old rules were broken. A carpenter could now own land. A widow could command respect. A new world was forming out of the ashes of the old. And somewhere on the road between Saint-Aubert and Rouen, a man and a woman warmed their hands over a fire and dreamed. Not of kings or priests, but of bread and peace, and maybe a home that didn't smell of death. For the first time in years, Thomas smiled. He looked at Isolde and said, "When spring comes, we build again." And this time, she believed him. The age of hunger. The snow came early that year. By the time the first flakes fell, Thomas and Isolde had settled in what had once been a small monastery farm, a few miles north of Rouen. The plague had emptied it, the monks long gone, their gardens grown wild with nettles and thorn bushes. But there was shelter. There was a well. And for people who had spent 2 years sleeping under open sky, that felt like luxury. Thomas patched the roof with scraps of broken wood and soaked linen. Isolde scavenged jars of honey and dried herbs from the monastery cellar. Together they began to live again, not just survive. Yet the hunger still lingered, heavy and patient. There were days when the snow melted early enough to expose patches of frozen ground, where Thomas dug for roots with his bare hands. Some nights they caught fish through holes cut in the ice, their fingers stiff and raw. But more often, they simply sat by the fire, speaking softly, pretending that the ache in their stomachs was just part of being alive. Then one morning, they found footprints in the snow. They weren't alone. At first, Thomas thought it might be wolves. But as he followed the tracks, he found something stranger. A group of people camped by the tree line, a dozen of them, wrapped in rags and smoke. Among them were children, thin, wide-eyed, silent as ghosts. When Thomas stepped into their clearing, a man raised a bow. "We don't mean harm," Thomas said, hands raised. "We have food." That last part was a lie. But it made the man hesitate. They called themselves the remnants of Evreux, farmers, widows, orphans, the last of a nearby village that had burned during the plague. Their leader, Henri, was a miller who'd once been rich, but now carried his family's bones in a linen sack. They were dying slowly, but not from sickness. From starvation. That night, Thomas and Isolde shared what little they had. A pot of fish broth, half a crust of bread. In return, Henri offered a trade, join forces, share the monastery, survive the winter together, and so the community of Saint-Auberd's Hill was born. The weeks that followed were filled with noise again, human noise. The sound of chopping wood, mending clothes, laughter, and sometimes tears. They buried the dead properly, marked the graves with wooden crosses. Thomas showed the men how to build traps for rabbits. Isolde taught the children how to dry herbs and make broth from grass and bark. But winter is long. By mid-February, their supplies were gone. They began boiling leather. Then candles. Then the bark from the monastery walls. And when even that failed, the talk began. Quiet, trembling talk of the unthinkable. It started when one of the children disappeared. A small boy named Lucas. His mother said he'd wandered into the woods. But Thomas saw the way Henri looked at her and how no one asked too many questions. The next day, someone brought back a pot of meat stew. No one asked where it came from. They just ate, hands shaking, tears running down their faces. Isolde refused. She sat by the fire all night, whispering prayers that no longer sounded holy. When Thomas finally confronted Henri, the man didn't deny it. "What would you have me do?" Henri said. "Starve while the boy froze in the snow? God sent us his flesh to live." Thomas struck him, but the truth was, part of him understood. Hunger was not just pain now, it was madness. That night, Thomas dreamed of snakes again. The first he'd ever caught, writhing in a pot. When he woke, he took Isolde's hand. "We leave," he said, "tonight." And they did. They left behind Saint-Auberd's Hill, the graves, the fires, and the faint smell of cooking meat that wasn't animal. They followed the river south through frost and mud, until the monastery was a memory swallowed by fog. They didn't speak for days. When they finally stopped near the ruins of a bridge, Isolde asked, "Do you think God still sees us?" Thomas stared at the gray water. "I think he closed his eyes long ago." As spring thawed the land, the world around them began to change. Caravans returned to the roads. Bells rang again in distant cities. Markets reopened, thin, fragile, hopeful, and with them came new laws. The nobles who had survived now needed workers. The serfs who remained were no longer bound by feudal chains. There were too few of them to enslave. For the first time in history, peasants had power. Thomas and Isolde reached a small town called Lisieux, where a merchant paid them in bread and silver to repair his wagons. There were others like them everywhere. Widows turned traders, beggars turned farmers. Europe was being reborn not by kings, but by survivors. Still, the famine haunted them. One afternoon, a merchant offered Thomas a bag of salted meat. "From the north," he said. "Cheap." But when Thomas cut it open, the smell turned his stomach. He threw it into the fire. "What was it?" Isolde asked. Thomas didn't answer. He just said, "The north still eats its dead." By summer, the roads were alive again with pilgrims, thieves, and dreamers. Thomas found work rebuilding bridges. Isolde started tending a small garden behind a burned inn. Life began, slowly, to look like life again. Children laughed. Church bells rang. The dead were finally left to rest. And yet, when the nights grew cold, Thomas still dreamed of the snake in the pot. One evening, as they sat by their small fire, a traveler joined them, an old man with bright eyes and a voice roughened by age. He said his name was Brother Alaric, once a monk, now a wanderer. He told them of what he'd seen in other lands. In Italy, people rebuilding marble cathedrals. In England, peasants rising against their lords. In Germany, alchemists searching for ways to purify the air. The world has died, Alaric said, but death is a kind of cleansing. What comes next will not be the same. Maybe better. Maybe worse, but new. Isolde smiled faintly. And what of the hunger? She asked. The monk looked into the fire. That never dies, he said softly. It just changes its shape. By the year 1352, Thomas and Isolde had built a small home on the edge of a forest. It wasn't much, a hut with a thatched roof and a wooden cross above the door. But it was theirs. They no longer hunted snakes. They no longer fled. They planted seeds in the thawed earth and waited for the green shoots of a new world. And sometimes, when they saw travelers on the road, thin, frightened, desperate, they shared what little they had. Not because they had forgotten the hunger, but because they remembered it too well. That winter, Thomas fell ill. The fever came quick, and the chill stayed deep. As he lay on the straw bed, Isolde held his hand and said, You'll see spring again. You promised, he smiled faintly. Then keep the promise for me, he whispered. And as snow fell again over the land, the man who had eaten snakes to live finally found peace. When spring came, Isolde planted wildflowers over his grave, red, yellow and pale white, and whispered, We lived. Thomas, we lived. Ashes and dawn, the world did not end. It simply changed its face. When the thaw came that spring, the earth itself seemed to breathe again. Wet soil steaming in the sun, grass pushing through mud, birds returning to roofs half broken by time. And in the middle of that fragile rebirth stood Isolde, the widow of a carpenter who had outlived the plague, the famine, and her own fear. She buried Thomas beneath the largest oak by the river. His grave was simple, a wooden cross carved by her own hand with no name. In this new world, names were a luxury. Survival was enough. For weeks after, she spoke to him as if he were still near. When she planted seeds, You'd have liked this soil. When she caught a fish, see, the river still remembers us. And when the nights grew too quiet, you promised spring, Thomas, and you kept it. That summer the roads filled again, not with soldiers or beggars, but with traders, men on foot leading carts of grain, women carrying baskets of herbs, children herding thin goats. Europe, after years of silence, began to hum again with human sound. Isolde joined them. She traded dried herbs and handmade salves for bread, salt, and fabric. Her hands, once calloused from hunger, became steady again, the hands of a healer. She'd learned which weeds soothed pain, which roots eased fever, which berries kept death away a little longer. People began to call her the widow healer of Lisieux, but she never took coin. Only food and stories. One evening, as the sun dipped red over the horizon, a merchant caravan arrived from the south. Italy, they said. They carried olive oil, silk, and strange powders that sparkled in the light. Among them was a man named Raffaello di Spina, who claimed he had seen the dead rise, not as ghosts, as ideas. In Florence, he said, people were painting again, building again, reading the old books the monks had once hidden from the people. The plague cleansed us, Raffaello said. We learned that life is too fragile for ignorance. So now we study everything. Stars, blood, even the way the heart beats. Isolde listened, fascinated. And do your people still starve? He smiled sadly. Some do, but we no longer die without asking why. The thought haunted her. What had all this suffering been for, if not to awaken something new? She left Lisieux that autumn, traveling with Raffaello's caravan through Burgundy, across the Rhône, and into the lands of the south, places where plague graves were now gardens and burnt churches were turning into schools. Everywhere she went, She met others like her, survivors who had turned their pain into purpose. A blacksmith who forged tools instead of swords. A nun who painted saints with faces of common peasants. A scholar who taught children how to write their own names. Europe was no longer a kingdom of kings. It was a continent of ghosts learning how to live again. But the hunger was not gone. In Marseille, Isolde saw ships unloading grain guarded by armed men. Prices were high. The poor still starved while the rich feasted in marble halls. It was the same sickness, just dressed in finer clothes. One night, she and Raffaello stood by the docks watching the torches burn. "I thought the plague killed greed," she said. Raffaello shook his head. "No, it only changed what we hunger for." He looked at her. "You heal bodies, but someone must heal souls. Who will do that? Maybe you." They grew close, not lovers, not yet, but bound by a shared memory of death. Together they traveled inland toward Avignon, the city of popes and pilgrims, where rumor said even the air shimmered with faith and fear. There, they found chaos. The church had grown fat while the people starved. Gold glittered in the cathedrals, while outside, women sold their hair for a loaf of bread. The priests preached that the plague had been punishment, yet they ate meat every day. One afternoon, as Isolde handed bread to a starving child, a priest struck her wrist. "You steal from God's portion," he spat. Isolde looked him in the eye. Then God should eat less. That night, they were driven out of Avignon. But word spread of the widow who defied the priests, and the people began to whisper her name like a secret prayer. She became a wanderer again, but no longer a victim. She was something else now, a spark in the ashes, and wherever she went, famine followed, but so did healing. She taught farmers how to dry grain, women how to brew medicine, men how to read the signs of disease in animals before it spread to humans. She was no saint. She still cried some nights, still spoke to Thomas under the stars, but she carried herself like someone who had made peace with the darkness. Years passed. By 1360, Europe had changed beyond recognition. Cities rose again, stronger than before. Trade returned, money flowed, and new art began to appear on walls. Paintings not just of Christ or kings, but of ordinary faces. People were remembering themselves. Yet beneath the beauty, the scars remained. In every feast, someone remembered hunger. In every song, someone heard the echo of bells tolling the dead. Isolde grew old, traveling those roads, a healer, a teacher, a survivor who outlived her time. When she reached Florence years later, she finally saw what Raffaello had spoken of: color, light, music. Artists painting angels that looked human. Scientists studying stars, not just scripture. And in the middle of it all, she felt Thomas beside her again. The carpenter who'd eaten snakes. Who dreamed of rebuilding a world. On her last night alive, she wrote a single line in her old, cracked notebook. "We lived like beasts to remember we were human." She placed it beside her fire, closed her eyes and drifted into sleep as dawn broke over the new world she'd helped to build. Outside, the bells of Florence rang, not for death, but for morning mass. The age of darkness was ending. And in the quiet streets, where flowers grew through cracks in the stones, the world, and for the first time in a century, smelled not of rot or smoke, but of bread. By the winter of 1349, the world felt like it had stopped breathing. Snow covered abandoned roads where carts once carried the dead. The plague had burned through towns like wildfire, but now hunger took its place. The survivors thought they'd escaped death. They hadn't. In England's northern villages, people returned to find their fields empty, livestock dead, and granaries looted. The few remaining farmers couldn't plant enough. Roads were too dangerous to travel. Trade was broken. Prices for grain skyrocketed and money lost meaning. The only thing that mattered now was food. At first they boiled bark, ate leather shoes, and scraped moss off stones. Then came the rats. They were easy to catch, slow from the cold, fat from feeding on the forgotten. Families roasted them over embers, telling themselves it was meat, telling their children to chew slowly. In the French countryside, entire villages vanished not from plague, but from starvation. Chroniclers wrote of mothers feeding their last crumbs to their children, then walking into the woods to die. Some said desperate men dug into graveyards, cutting flesh from corpses when even rats were gone. But here's where the story turns. Hunger, in a twisted way, forced people to become resourceful. The survivors learned how to fish frozen rivers, how to trap birds, how to boil nettles and acorns into something that barely resembled soup. Monasteries began growing herbs again, teaching peasants which wild plants were safe to eat. And slowly, spring came. The snow melted. Fields that had lain empty for years were plowed again. The air filled with the smell of wet earth and the sound of hammers rebuilding burned-out homes. The survivors didn't just return to their old ways, they reinvented them. They refused to live under the same system that had let them starve. Serfs demanded wages. Farmers left their manors for towns. Labor was suddenly powerful because there weren't enough hands to do the work. Wages rose. For the first time, ordinary people had a say in their fate. And yet, the memory of that hunger stayed. People still whispered about the winter of rats, the time when nobles and peasants alike had eaten vermin to survive. It became a kind of dark legend, passed from fireside to fireside, a reminder of how fragile life was, and how strong desperation could make you. In the years that followed, the famine and plague reshaped Europe completely. Cities became cleaner, medicine advanced, and people questioned old beliefs. But deep down, they never forgot the taste of that winter. Because once you've been hungry enough to eat a rat, you never see the world the same way again. The rebirth of a broken world. When the hunger finally eased and the dead stopped multiplying, Europe looked nothing like the one that existed before the Black Death. It was quieter, emptier. The silence itself felt sacred, as if the land was holding its breath, waiting for something new to begin. Here's the thing. Disaster doesn't just destroy, it clears the way for transformation. In England, farmers who once worked as servants for lords realized something powerful. They were now the rarest thing in Europe, living labor. A man who survived the plague could demand double, even triple his old wages. If his master refused, he could simply walk away and find work elsewhere. Whole manors collapsed because there weren't enough peasants left to farm the fields. The government tried to stop it. In 1351, England passed the Statute of Laborers, a desperate law ordering people to accept pre-plague wages. But it didn't work. People had seen too much suffering to obey old masters. The idea of freedom, of owning your work, your life, began to spread like wildfire. Across the continent, cities became magnets for the ambitious. Florence, Venice, and Paris swelled with craftsmen and traders. Guilds, early versions of workers' unions, grew powerful. Trade routes reopened, carrying not just goods but ideas. Printing presses would come later, but already, something was stirring. A hunger for knowledge to match the hunger that had nearly killed them. Churches, once filled with terrified prayers for survival, became centers for rebuilding. Priests and monks recorded what had happened, trying to understand it in both divine and earthly terms. Many began to question the church's absolute authority. If God allowed this, people whispered, perhaps we should seek answers elsewhere. That whisper would, in time, fuel the Reformation. Meanwhile, art changed too. Painters no longer only depicted saints and kings. They painted people, ordinary men and women with weary eyes, holding shovels or bread or children. Life itself became sacred again. One of the most astonishing things that happened was demographic. With fewer people, there was more land, more food, and, paradoxically, more opportunity. Survivors inherited homes, farms, and property. For the first time in centuries, the lower classes began to taste prosperity, and with prosperity came curiosity. They wanted to build, to explore, to learn. Scholars started studying medicine in new ways. They dissected bodies, something once forbidden by the church, to truly understand disease. Astronomy, mathematics, architecture, all of it accelerated. Without even realizing it, Europe had set the stage for the Renaissance. In other words, out of rot came rebirth. But not everyone celebrated. The elite feared what they saw: peasants growing bold, women taking up trades, young people refusing to serve. Tensions simmered, leading to uprisings like the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. It was bloody, short, and ultimately crushed, but it carried a message. We will not go back to how things were. What this really means is that the Black Death, for all its horror, gave birth to the modern world. It forced humanity to rebuild itself, not just in stone and timber, but in spirit. It taught people to question power, to value knowledge, to demand fairness, and to never again take life for granted. By the end of the 14th century, Europe stood on the edge of something new. The air was alive with invention. Windmills turning, looms spinning, churches rising higher and more intricate than ever before. People planted gardens over forgotten graves, baked bread where there had once been famine, and sang songs not of mourning, but of endurance. And perhaps that's the greatest miracle of all. Not that humanity survived the Black Death, but that after losing nearly half its world, it found the strength to dream again. The dawn of the Renaissance, when the light returned. Hey! So tonight we're stepping into the years after the storm, the years when Europe began to breathe again. The plague had ripped through cities and countrysides, erasing entire families. But here's the thing. What came next wasn't just recovery. It was reinvention. Humanity didn't just heal. It transformed. Let's paint the scene. It's the mid-14th century. Town bells that once tolled for the dead now ring for weddings and market days again. The air that once carried the stench of death is filled with the sound of hammers, rebuilding walls, roofs, cathedrals. People walk differently now. They speak differently. The arrogance of the old world, the one that believed it was untouchable, is gone. What's left is a strange, fragile wisdom that life is short, unpredictable, and therefore worth living deeply. The birth of a new mindset. Before the Black Death, the church dominated thought. Every question, from how the stars moved to why illness spread, had a divine answer. But the plague cracked that certainty open. Why had God allowed such horror? Why did prayers not save them? When people couldn't find spiritual answers, they turned to observation, to reason. Medicine took its first true scientific breath. Physicians began dissecting corpses in Italy, trying to see the causes of disease instead of simply praying them away. Scholars like Mondino de Liuzzi and Guy de Chauliac started documenting symptoms, anatomy, and treatments. Their writings, copied by hand and passed around Europe, became the backbone of Renaissance medicine. And it wasn't just medicine. Architecture changed too. The Gothic arches of the old cathedrals slowly gave way to domes and symmetry, a new obsession with balance, order, and human proportion. The seeds of humanism Florence became the epicenter of this intellectual quake. In the years after the plague, the city exploded with creativity. Wealthy families like the Medici began funding artists and thinkers, not just to glorify God, but to celebrate human potential. The word humanism wasn't coined yet, but its spirit was everywhere. Scholars dusted off old Latin and Greek manuscripts, forgotten works by Aristotle, Plato, Cicero. These weren't books about heaven. They were about earth, about logic, reason, ethics, beauty. And they whispered a new idea, that man himself could shape destiny. The old world saw humans as sinners crawling toward salvation. The new one began to see them as creators, flawed, yes, but capable of greatness. The return of art and beauty, you could feel this shift most clearly in art. Painters stopped making flat, golden icons and started painting depth, light, and emotion. Giotto was one of the first, giving figures weight, shadow, and sorrow. His frescoes showed real people, with wrinkles and grief and hope in their eyes. A generation later, that spark became flame. Florence, Venice, Rome, the cities became laboratories of beauty. Brunelleschi experimented with perspective, Donatello carved lifelike statues, and Masaccio painted walls that seemed to breathe, and it all started because death had made life precious again. People no longer wanted art that told them only how to die well. They wanted art that showed them how to live well. A changed economy, a changed society. The plague had destroyed the feudal order. Now merchants and bankers replaced nobles as the new elite. Trade routes reopened from the Mediterranean to the Silk Road, carrying not just spices and silk, but ideas. Paper, a technology from China, became common, making books cheaper to produce. Literacy spread. Knowledge, once locked behind monastery walls, began to seep into the streets. The Medici Bank in Florence, the Fuggers in Germany. These were the first true capitalists. They didn't fight wars for land. They built empires with credit, trade, and art patronage. The new spirit of exploration. The same curiosity that made artists study anatomy drove explorers to question the edges of the map. "What's beyond the horizon?" they asked. Within a century, ships would sail west toward the unknown. Columbus, da Gama, Magellan, all were products of this restless post-plague generation. A world once terrified of death now chased the thrill of discovery. Lessons from the darkness. The Black Death had stripped humanity to its bones. In doing so, it had forced people to see what truly mattered: creativity, knowledge, compassion, resilience. When survivors looked back, they didn't just remember the hunger or the fear. They remembered how they had endured. They remembered neighbors sharing bread, mothers burying children and still finding the will to keep living, craftsmen who built again from rubble. That endurance became Europe's heartbeat. It shaped philosophy, art, science, and politics, and slowly, the Renaissance, that radiant bloom of genius and beauty, unfolded from the compost of death. The moral thread. Here's the quiet truth behind all this. Every civilization's rebirth begins with humility. The plague humbled humanity. It shattered arrogance, hierarchy, and blind faith. And from that humility grew wisdom. They learned that no wall, no empire, no amount of gold could protect you from fate. But courage, creativity, and knowledge, those could rebuild a world. So when we talk about Michelangelo's David, Da Vinci's notebooks, or Botticelli's paintings, we're not just talking about art. We're talking about triumph over despair. Every brushstroke, every melody, every invention whispered the same defiant message. We lived, and we will make this life worth it. And that, more than any throne or crown, is what truly ended the Middle Ages. The Renaissance unleashed, the age of discovery and genius. Hey, so tonight we're diving into the part of history where everything, art, science, exploration, suddenly ignites. The darkness that began with the Black Death has burned away, and in its place rises a feverish, electric energy. Europe isn't just surviving anymore. It's thriving. It's dreaming, experimenting, pushing the limits of what it means to be human. Let's break it down. Because what happens here, in the 15th and 16th centuries, reshapes the world forever. The fire of curiosity. Imagine walking through Florence around 1450. The streets hum with artisans, merchants, sculptors, scholars, printers. Everyone seems to be building, painting, or inventing something. Workshops glow like small suns, and at the heart of it all, curiosity. This is the moment when knowledge stops belonging only to the church and starts belonging to everyone who dares to learn. Libraries open, manuscripts are copied, and human beings, for the first time in centuries, begin to believe that the mind itself is divine. It's not arrogance, it's wonder. The genius generation enter the giants. Leonardo da Vinci, illegitimate, self-taught, endlessly curious, sketches flying machines centuries before airplanes. He studies water currents, human muscles, bird wings, and light itself. His notebooks are chaos and brilliance bound together. Michelangelo carves David, not as a biblical figure cowering before Goliath, but as a symbol of human strength, intelligence, and defiance. Every vein, every tension in the marble whispers, we are capable of greatness. Raphael paints harmony, Donatello sculpts realism, Titian brings color to life. These men weren't painting saints because they had to, they painted them because they wanted to understand them. The old medieval world was about obedience. The Renaissance was about understanding. The printing revolution, then comes the machine that changes everything, Gutenberg's printing press. Before printing, books were copied by hand one at a time by monks. A single Bible could take years to produce. But now, dozens of copies could be printed in weeks. Knowledge exploded. People read about medicine, astronomy, philosophy. Ideas that once took decades to spread now traveled across Europe in months. And with knowledge came power. The kind that kings couldn't control and priests couldn't silence. Discovery. Beyond the horizon, while scholars were mapping the human mind, explorers were mapping the earth itself. Christopher Columbus, sailing under Spain's flag, crossed the Atlantic and stumbled upon a new world. Vasco da Gama opened a sea route to India, changing global trade forever. Magellan circumnavigated the globe, proving the earth wasn't just round, it was connected. But here's what's important. These weren't just geographical discoveries. They were psychological ones. Humanity was realizing that the world was bigger, and that they could master it. This was the same defiance that had carried them through the plague. Once you've faced extinction, no ocean seems too wide. The science awakens, and while ships sailed and artists painted, another quiet revolution was brewing in the mind of thinkers like Copernicus, Galileo, and Vesalius. Copernicus dared to suggest the unthinkable, that the Earth wasn't the center of the universe. Galileo built telescopes and saw moons orbiting Jupiter, proof that Copernicus was right. Vesalius dissected the human body and mapped its bones, veins, and organs like a cartographer mapping a new continent. Science was no longer heresy. It was a form of worship, not of God, but of truth. The human spirit in full bloom by the 1500s. Europe was alive with contradictions, faith and reason, wealth and famine, art and war, but underneath it all, there was this unstoppable momentum. People painted ceilings that reached heaven, built domes that defied gravity, wrote plays that dissected the soul. Shakespeare in England gave voice to every corner of the human heart. Ambition, love, betrayal, madness. Erasmus and Thomas More questioned politics and morality. Everywhere you looked, people were asking, what does it mean to be human? And that question, that restless pursuit of self, is what defined the Renaissance more than any invention or discovery. The moral pulse now. Here's where it gets really interesting. The Renaissance wasn't pure light. It carried shadows too. Greed, conquest, colonialism. The same curiosity that drove discovery also justified domination. Empires rose, indigenous peoples suffered, wealth flowed one way, to Europe. But even in that darkness, the idea that every human could learn, think, and create, that idea survived. And it changed everything. The legacy, when you trace the line from the plague to the Renaissance, it's not just history, it's transformation. The generation that once boiled rats for food gave birth to the generation that painted the Sistine Chapel. The people who buried their loved ones in mass graves became the ones who mapped the stars. They proved that even when the world ends, the human spirit rebuilds. And not just rebuilds, evolves. The lesson. Here's the thing about history. The worst times always leave behind the strongest survivors. The plague didn't just kill millions. It forced humanity to question everything. Power, faith, purpose. And out of that questioning came progress. The Renaissance wasn't just about art. It was a revenge against despair. It was the human race standing up and saying, "We've seen death. Now we choose to create life." By the end of the 16th century, the Renaissance had spread from Italy to France, England, and beyond. The seeds it planted, science, art, exploration, humanism, would grow into the Enlightenment, Revolution, and the modern world. That's the real miracle. Not that we survived the darkness, but that we learned to turn darkness into light. The Enlightenment, when knowledge became power. Hey, so tonight, we're leaving behind the cathedrals and paintings of the Renaissance and stepping into something sharper, colder maybe, but infinitely more daring. This is the moment when Europe's imagination turns into intellect. When humanity stops just admiring beauty and starts demanding truth. We're talking about the 17th and 18th centuries, the Enlightenment, or as some historians call it, the Age of Reason. And trust me, this isn't just about dusty philosophers and candlelit studies. This is where humanity learns how to think for itself. The world, after the Renaissance by 1600, Europe had changed beyond recognition. Cities buzzed with trade, universities were thriving, and printed books were everywhere. The printing press, once a novelty, had become the engine of revolution. People were reading everything: science, politics, philosophy, forbidden texts. The church no longer owned the monopoly on truth. Ideas flowed like wildfire through taverns, salons, and coffee houses. The same curiosity that made Da Vinci study the mechanics of flight now made scientists like Isaac Newton study gravity, motion, and light. And when Newton dropped that apple, well, supposedly, he wasn't just discovering gravity, he was proving something radical. The universe runs on laws. Not luck, not wrath, not miracles. And if there are laws, then maybe, just maybe, anyone with reason and courage can uncover them. Science becomes a revolution. Before the Enlightenment, science had to hide behind faith. But now, it stood on its own. Galileo had been silenced by the Inquisition, but his telescope lived on, now in the hands of hundreds of students who dared to look at the stars. Robert Boyle studied chemistry. William Harvey mapped how blood moves through the body. Antony van Leeuwenhoek peered through his handmade microscope and saw tiny creatures. Life itself at its smallest scale. Every discovery chipped away at superstition. Every experiment whispered the same quiet truth. We don't need permission to understand the world. The philosophers and their dangerous ideas. And then came the thinkers, the philosophes. They weren't priests or kings. They were writers, rebels, and dreamers with ink-stained hands and dangerous opinions. Voltaire mocked the church with biting wit. He said, "Think for yourselves, and let others enjoy the privilege to do so." John Locke in England wrote that every person was born with natural rights, life, liberty, and property. Rousseau argued that governments existed only because people allowed them to, a social contract. Montesquieu proposed the separation of powers, the foundation of modern democracy. These weren't abstract musings. They were seeds of revolution. For centuries, kings had ruled by divine right. But the Enlightenment flipped that on its head. If reason was divine, then maybe every human mind was sacred. That idea, that knowledge is power, was the most dangerous one of all. The salons and the underground networks picture this. Paris, 1750. Chandeliers glimmer over long tables in the salon of Madame Geoffrin. Artists, scientists, writers, and revolutionaries gather to argue about freedom, science, morality, and the universe. Outside, pamphlets circulate anonymously. Banned writings, heretical manifestos, radical dreams. Books like Encyclopédie, edited by Denis Diderot, attempt to compile all human knowledge in one place. It's ambitious, rebellious, and beautifully human. Every page challenges authority. Every entry says, "The mind belongs to no one but you." The revolutions. It ignited ideas. Once loosed, can't be caged. By the late 18th century, Enlightenment thought began to boil over into action. In America, the Founding Fathers, men like Jefferson, Franklin, and Paine, read Locke and Montesquieu and decided that people had the right to govern themselves. The Declaration of Independence wasn't just political, it was philosophical. All men are created equal. In France, Voltaire's sarcasm and Rousseau's passion ignited the French Revolution. The cry of liberté, égalité, fraternité shook the world. Monarchs fell, empires trembled. It was bloody, chaotic, and often hypocritical, but it was unstoppable. The Enlightenment didn't just teach people how to think. It taught them that they had the right to. The birth of the modern world, let's be real, the Enlightenment wasn't perfect. Many of its thinkers were blind to their own contradictions. They preached equality, but ignored women and colonized peoples. But the foundation they laid, the belief in human reason, individual liberty, and scientific progress, became the backbone of modern civilization. Hospitals replaced superstition with medicine. Governments began to build on rights instead of bloodlines. Education spread, literacy soared, and art evolved from divine worship to human exploration. Music, poetry, theater, all pulsing with a belief in the potential of man. The moral of the age, the Black Death, had broken humanity. The Renaissance had made it dream again, and the Enlightenment, it made humanity think. It proved that even after centuries of darkness, fear, and control, people could rebuild their minds the same way they rebuilt their cities, brick by brick, question by question. Because here's what the Enlightenment really taught. Freedom isn't given. It's learned. Truth isn't revealed. It's discovered, and once you learn to ask why, you can never go back to blind obedience. The legacy: by the dawn of the 19th century, the world was forever changed. Science had taken root. Democracy had been born. Industry was awakening. Humanity was stepping into a new age, confident, curious, and still carrying the scars of every century before it. It's wild when you think about it, that all this light came from one of history's darkest nights. That a world once eating rats and snakes to survive would one day map the stars, write constitutions, and invent machines that could fly. That's not just history. That's evolution. Moral, intellectual, spiritual. The Enlightenment didn't end the story. It opened the door to the next one, the modern age. The children of hunger. By the winter of 1350, Europe was a continent of orphans. The plague had taken their parents, the wars had taken their homes, and the famine had taken their strength. Yet somehow, life went on, in strange, desperate ways. In small villages scattered across France, Germany, and England, there were children barely 10 years old who had learned to live like hunters. They dug through ruins, scavenged for scraps, and trapped rats in cellars that had once belonged to nobles. They didn't play anymore. They schemed. They survived. In one chronicle from the region of Alsace, a monk wrote about the little wolves of God, bands of orphans who roamed the countryside, carrying torches and sticks, begging and stealing food. They laugh at priests. They fear no lord, he wrote, for hunger is their master now. One night, a wandering priest named Brother Matthias stumbled upon such a group. 12 children huddled in an abandoned barn, roasting something over a small fire. When he came closer, he realized it wasn't a rabbit. It was a rat, cleaned, roasted, and shared carefully among them, each taking a small bite as if it were sacred. He wanted to stop them, to speak, but he couldn't. The smell of the meat hit his empty stomach like a blow. He hadn't eaten in 2 days, and so he sat down silently, crossed himself, and accepted the smallest piece they offered him. In his later writings, he confessed, "I have eaten with angels and with devils. I do not know which they were." Meanwhile, across the channel, in the marshlands of East Anglia, villagers were boiling grass and bark into soup. In coastal towns, fishermen told stories of pulling corpses from the water, their fingers bitten off by the living who'd drifted too far into madness. But not all was despair. Some saw opportunity. Merchants from the Italian city-states, Florence, Venice, Genoa, realized that with so many dead, there was land to buy, houses to claim, and fortunes to rebuild. The great families began to rise again, built on the bones of the past. In Florence, a banker named Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici quietly began lending money to desperate farmers, knowing that when the famine eased, they would owe him everything. His descendants would later shape the Renaissance itself, art, architecture, and power, all born from this era of ruin. Yet far from the cities, in the empty villages, the children of hunger continued to wander. They became stories parents told to frighten their own. If you waste bread, the hungry children will come for you. And centuries later, Travelers would still find the ruins of those barns, still whispering with ghostly echoes of laughter, the kind of laughter that only comes from those who have looked death in the eye and eaten it to survive. Key highlight: the children born into the famine became a new kind of survivor, fearless, wild, and shaped by hunger. Their existence forced Europe to confront not just disease or war, but the raw instinct for survival. Moral lesson: even in the darkest times, human life adapts. Hunger can twist innocence into savagery, yet from that same desperation, the seeds of renewal and resilience are born. The dawn of the Renaissance. The year was 1401. Florence, a city that had once reeked of plague, where corpses had filled the Arno River, was alive again. Bells rang over red-tiled roofs. Merchants shouted in the markets. Painters set up scaffolds in half-ruined churches, their brushes trembling not from fear but from excitement. Europe was waking from a nightmare. For almost 50 years, the Black Death had left the continent broken and hollow. Entire villages had vanished. Monasteries were silent. The land was littered with empty manors and burned-out towns. But now, people had begun to believe again, not only in God, but in themselves. That was the spark. Because when faith in institutions crumbles, faith in human hands begins. Florence became the beating heart of something entirely new, something no one yet had a name for. But centuries later, we'd call it the Renaissance, the contest that changed the world. It began, oddly enough, with a door. In 1401, the city announced a competition. Who could design new bronze doors for the baptistery of Florence? Doors that would glorify the city and the church, symbolizing renewal after death. The contestants were artists and goldsmiths, but two names stood above the rest: Lorenzo Ghiberti and Filippo Brunelleschi. Both men were survivors of the plague's aftermath, raised in a world that had starved, frozen, and clawed its way back to life. They poured that hunger into their art. When the judges unveiled their designs, Florence gasped. The old Gothic stiffness was gone. The figures breathed, twisted, and reached toward heaven, human, yet divine. Ghiberti won the contest, but Brunelleschi didn't give up. He left Florence and studied the ruins of ancient Rome, measuring, sketching, dreaming. He wanted to learn how men without machines had built empires. He returned years later with something no one had ever seen: a design for a dome that would crown the unfinished Cathedral of Florence. A dome so vast, so perfect, and so impossible that people said it would either make him immortal or destroy him. It made him immortal. The shadow of memory, but even as art and science bloomed, the shadow of the plague lingered. You could see it in the faces of the saints carved on cathedral walls, their eyes too hollow, their robes too thin. You could feel it in the paintings, angels descending not in triumph, but in mercy. Even the great writers of the time, Boccaccio, Petrarch, and Chaucer, wrote of death as an old acquaintance. Their words still smelled faintly of ashes, yet their message was clear. Life is fragile. Therefore, it must be lived fully. People began to paint themselves, to study anatomy, to chart the stars, to map the world. The hunger for survival turned into a hunger for knowledge, and that hunger changed everything. The new human before the plague. Men saw themselves as small, servants of God, subjects of kings, dust before destiny. After the plague, they realized, if death could take everyone, kings, bishops, peasants, then maybe all souls were equal. This quiet idea grew louder with each generation. Scholars rediscovered forgotten Greek texts that spoke of reason and beauty. Artists studied the human body not as sin, but as creation. They built statues that breathed, painted ceilings that opened to the heavens, and wrote verses that dared to question everything. It was as if Europe had stepped out of the tomb. Hunger. Reimagined. The hunger that once drove people to eat rats and roots now drove them to create. The same desperation that once filled mass graves now filled canvases and libraries. It wasn't peace, not yet. There were still wars, plagues, and corruption. But there was a shift in spirit. Europe had learned something profound. That after you've eaten snakes to survive, after you've buried your own family, after you've seen hell on earth, you either go mad or you make something beautiful enough to make it worth it. And so they did. Key highlight: the Renaissance wasn't born out of comfort. It was born from trauma. It was a collective act of defiance against despair. A declaration that humanity could still create beauty even after living through horror. Moral lesson: suffering can destroy, but it can also purify. The people who built cathedrals after famine, who painted the sky after plague, they remind us that art, knowledge, and love are the truest forms of survival. The fire spreads from Florence to the world. By the middle of the 15th century, the spark that had ignited in Florence was catching everywhere. You could feel it in the wind that swept through Italy, in the smell of ink, in the clang of chisels, in the quiet hum of minds waking up after a century of sleep. Europe was no longer a continent of ashes. It was a forge, and from that forge the modern world was being hammered into shape. The ripple effect: when Florence began to thrive again, it didn't just rebuild itself, it inspired others. Venice, once a merchant city floating on fear and pestilence, reinvented itself as a haven for art and printing. Genoa rebuilt its harbors. Milan turned steel and stone into sculpture and fortresses. Ideas began to travel faster than armies. Painters moved from city to city, architects carried sketches in leather satchels, scholars traded manuscripts across borders. What the plague had torn apart, curiosity began to stitch together. By 1450, whispers of change reached northern Europe. Cities like Bruges, Ghent, and later Nuremberg and Paris started to bloom in their own ways. Borrowing, reshaping, reimagining. The language of rebirth had no borders. The power of the press. Then in Mainz, Germany, a man named Johannes Gutenberg quietly changed everything. He was a craftsman, a tinkerer who had survived the instability of post-plague Europe. For years he had watched how knowledge remained trapped, handwritten by monks, one copy at a time. So he built a machine that would shatter that barrier, the printing press. In 1455, his invention printed the Gutenberg Bible. The world would never be the same again. Books, once rarer than gold, became weapons of thought. Suddenly, a merchant in London could read what a scholar in Florence had written. A student in Paris could study Aristotle. A priest in Prague could read scripture himself and question it. The plague had destroyed the old order. Gutenberg's press built the new one, and that, perhaps, was humanity's true revenge on death, to preserve knowledge so it could never die again. The artists who remembered the dead even as beauty returned. Artists didn't forget what the world had gone through. Take Hieronymus Bosch. His paintings were nightmares turned into color. Twisting creatures, burning cities, and faces of terror. Yet buried inside them was the question, what have we learned? Or Albrecht Dürer, who drew the apocalypse not as prophecy, but as memory. The Renaissance wasn't just about light and harmony. It was a mirror, and sometimes that mirror showed the bones of the old world beneath the fresh paint. The age of discovery, while Europe rebuilt its soul, its sailors began to chase the edges of the world. Maps, once filled with monsters and blank spaces, began to stretch outward. The Mediterranean gave way to the Atlantic to the unknown. Portugal sent ships south around Africa. Spain looked west, into mystery. When Christopher Columbus finally crossed the ocean in 1492, he wasn't just looking for spice or gold. He was chasing a dream born from centuries of loss. The dream that there was something beyond despair. It was the same human instinct that had made Brunelleschi build a dome too large to exist. The same hunger that had made peasants rise and thinkers question. Now, it reached across oceans. Of course, that discovery brought both wonder and cruelty, new lands, new trade, and new suffering. But it marked something irreversible: humanity's refusal to stay small. The science of survival as explorers mapped the earth. Others began to map the heavens, and even the body itself. Leonardo da Vinci dissected corpses in candlelight, sketching bones and muscles not out of morbid curiosity, but out of reverence for the human form. Copernicus quietly wrote that the Earth wasn't the center of the universe, and Galileo, years later, would look through his telescope and whisper, "Eppur si muove." And yet it moves. Every discovery, every invention, every brush stroke was a rebellion against death, a way of saying, you can take our bodies, but not our wonder. The return of faith and doubt, but not everyone celebrated the new world. The church, once the only authority, began to feel the tremor beneath its feet. Too much knowledge, too many questions, too much freedom. The same press that spread Bibles also spread dissent. Men like Martin Luther would soon use it to challenge Rome itself, sparking a revolution of faith that would tear Europe apart again. Yet even that, the Reformation, was born from the same seed that had sprouted after the plague. The belief that every soul could speak directly to truth. A civilization reforged by 1500, Europe was almost unrecognizable from the land that had eaten rats to survive a century earlier. Where there had once been despair, there was ambition. Where there had been superstition, there was inquiry. Where there had been famine, there were feasts, not just of food, but of ideas. The people who had stared into the black eyes of death had learned one thing. Life must not only be endured, but expressed. The plague had taught them the cost of ignorance and fear. The Renaissance taught them the power of courage and creation, and both, together, made humanity what it is. Key highlight: the Renaissance spread like wildfire because it was fueled by something universal: survival. From the ruins of famine and fear came invention, art, and discovery, the greatest transformation in history born from the darkest suffering. Moral lesson: every civilization faces collapse. What defines humanity isn't how often it falls, but how it rises, and what it dares to build next. Even after eating snakes to survive, we built cathedrals to the stars. The ending. The Ayub feast after famine. And so, after centuries of death, hunger, and rebirth, the world stood at a strange new threshold. Europe, once choked by plague and fear, was now bursting with life. Cities that had been silent graveyards now echoed with music and laughter. Ships cut through oceans once thought endless. Libraries filled with books instead of prayers for the dying. But the people had not forgotten. They carried the memory of the hunger, of what it meant to starve so deeply that even rats or snakes became food. They remembered the stench of burning bodies, the silence of winter villages, the desperate prayers whispered into cold soil. That memory became their teacher. They learned that power could vanish in a heartbeat, that kings and beggars could share the same grave, that faith, stripped of compassion, could rot like a corpse. But they also learned something far greater, that even when the world ends, hope begins again. Because here's the thing: every civilization is tested by fire. The Black Death was Europe's fire, and from that fire came light. The peasants who once dug graves became the builders of cathedrals. The monks who once copied prayers by hand became the first printers. The children who once scavenged for food became explorers, artists, and thinkers who changed the shape of the earth itself. Out of starvation came invention. Out of loss came meaning. Out of silence came song. Humanity, scarred but not broken, had learned its oldest and most enduring lesson. We survive not because we are the strongest, but because we remember. We remember what it costs to lose everything. We remember how fragile life is, how precious every sunrise can be. And in that remembering, in art, in science, in compassion, we defy death itself. So when you look at the domes of Florence, the pages of Leonardo's notebooks, or the stars through Galileo's telescope, remember what came before them: the hunger, the fear, the cold nights when people ate snakes just to see one more morning. Because all of this, every painting, every discovery, every song, was humanity's answer to the grave. The Renaissance wasn't just a rebirth, it was a revenge against despair. And that is how a world that once starved learned to feast. Again, not on food, but on knowledge, beauty, and the endless hunger to live. Final moral lesson. No darkness lasts forever. Every age of despair carries within it the seed of rebirth. The ones who suffer the most often become the ones who rebuild the world, because they've already seen what losing it feels like.